Okay, so before we start on today's lecture that primarily focuses on psychoanalytical, psychological decay of Kafka, what we're going to do is we're going to shortly revise what we have studied so far. So in the first lecture, we went through everything that unraveled in the text. So we studied the text piece by piece, some of the important lectures that I think are very important to analyze when we went through the texts. But we also studied what being Kafkaesque really meant, or do we find the notion of Kafkaesque in the contemporary context of life? So, with that, we looked into how being Kafkaesque or having a Kafkaesque phenomenon primarily looked into trying to figure out a puzzle, a complete puzzle with puzzle pieces that are completely ambiguous to our final project. Now, what does that really mean in the context of society, modern society, or the self, really? We are in a very utilitarian, or rather cold, rational utilitarian space that controls whatever we do or desire to have. And our desires also change with time and generation. And this is what we find in the European Western philosophy studies as well. The European context of the time that Kafka had written this text was primarily focused on science and the innovation of science, the changes of and the complete shift from the pastoral regions to the industrial regions. And this industrialization was so mechanic that we can't help but remove ourselves from the romanticized idea of life, nature, and even godhood for a second. Because if you read or when you've read Dostoevsky, you understood that because there is a decay of the soul, there is a decay of the body. Kafkaesque then focuses on this confusion that in this bureaucracy that we live in, it's so confusing, it's so ambiguous and so open-ended that we don't find value in what we were pursuing in the first place. There is a lack of passion that we also find in Metamorphosis as well. Gregor Samsa, who was initially a traveling salesman, was the only earning source of his family, which gave him a form of structure in the family, a space, and a respect that he almost always wanted to pursue, even if he didn't really enjoy working that much. But his transformations are very important because this is where we studied, and in the later lectures, we studied into and looked into the Marxist analysis of life in general. We primarily focused more on labor alienation and what labor alienation really focuses on. And আমরা যখন labor alienation notionটা দেখি, তখন আমরা বুঝতে পারি যে this labor alienation notion focuses on how you are completely alienated, not from people you love, people you admire, or your passion, but also the self. We time and again don't really understand or know what Samsa really wants or likes because at the very beginning of the text, on the beginning of the pages, we realize that he has a constant anxiety of going back to work. This reminds us to understand, what does Gregor really like? We know what he doesn't like. He doesn't like going back to work, but he has to go to work. And that gives him a driving passion, particularly because he's very much aware that his father is quite absent. And this again showcases an emasculated form of a modern man in Europe or a westernized society, that if you don't work hard enough, or if you don't earn enough, or you're not completely financially available for a certain family or a certain group of people, you're no longer very relevant. And this realization is what we know that Samsa has. But let's think for a second, what does Samsa really like? We know that he likes breakfast food, and we know that in his metamorphosis, these factors that he really likes slowly changes. But this certain decay of the human body is very telling. But when we notice in this certain discourses, and we go back to Marxist analysis, I'm just going to go there right over here, we find that there is a systemic anxiety. And I call it systemic anxiety, particularly because he knows what is going to happen if he loses his job. He comes to a realization that as he's metamorphizing or morphing into an insect, the process in itself is showcased so brilliantly in the text or in the first few pages by the voice that we hear. The voice is slowly transforming. And when we see that the clerk mentions that, do you hear that voice? Do you hear him? That sounds like an animal voice. That showcases that even when he has the ability to speak, and the tone is very important, he's still not quite relevant. He becomes alien because his truest self is designed and deciphered through his job, his ability to be punctual. But a capitalist society will tell you that you haven't done enough or you haven't put more effort. And this is where we find the notion of the chief and how the chief has commonly mentioned how he has missed some of the deadlines or he isn't quite as proficient in his work as they had expected him to be. While this was quite shocking for him because not only was he working really hard or his best capacity, he also realizes that he's completely misinterpreted himself and how he was seen in in the face or in the perception of those he had seen every day. Because if you do a 9 to 5 job, your majority of your time is with people that you are working with. And that's the sense of betrayal, I feel, because in this like tyrannical representation of life, how the conversion of workers and how he's converted to something quite irrelevant is very important to discuss. For that, I would go back to the text and let's see some of the lines right over here. So right over here, you can see what the speaker is saying. He felt himself included once again in the circle of humanity. Once again in the circle of humanity. What does that really say about how he feels? A very small amount, a very tiny speck amount of um, motivation is what he really needed. He really didn't need much because when he was unable to open the door because he's become an insect, he's trying his best to prove that he's worthy of he's worthy of providing for his family. He's worthy of working. And this is very telling when we try to look into the notion of disability and physical incapability or emotional incapability, that even for the time being momentarily, if you're unable to sustain, there is no day off. And it's very punishing of how the social structure, the capitalist structure, ingrains within your psyche. And that's what we find in Gregor Samsa's work as well, because he keeps pushing himself, he keeps pushing his body. And at a time, we realize that he keeps thinking or imagining in his mind, which we later will study in today's lecture of intentionality. He thinks about how him morphing into an insect is possibly because a couple of days before he had a pain in his back, but he really brushed it off because he really needed to go back to work. Yeah. So that idea is interesting because him morphing into an insect, how does he really accept it? He accepts it very quietly, very gently, as if it's an everyday task. With that, we find that the people who truly initially really believed in him was not the father or the clerk, but rather the mother and the sister. There was a sense of mourning, grieving, which seems so punishing when we read throughout the text. When you notice that his mother is constantly trying to justify that he's very ill, is a sense of passiveness that we find because while she's trying to justify these narratives around his son, she's also unable to prove that he is truly himself because no one in his family really knows who he truly is other than being the sole earner of the family. And with that, we find that when he does bring about his true form or the insect form, his mother is astonished, shocked, and that she's incredibly scared of his own son. And that is also a sense of surprise for his son as well, because Gregor Samsa suddenly realizes as he's calling out to his mother, there is an absence of compassion and love that was initially found in the closed spaces. We must also understand how in this text we find the dynamic of the word three. Everything is happening in three, if you notice that when you keep reading the text, we find, yes, it's truly that there are multiple voices in this text. It's very dialogical, very polyphonic, but we do find that to reach to his door, you have to go through three more doors. And there are three family members in this context. And as we finish the text, we realize that there are three different identities, or at least this is what I feel, and Nabokov also feels that there are three identities. The first identity was Gregor Samsa as the traveling salesman, a young man in his prime. The second would be the morphing and the metamorphosized body, which is the insect, but still capable enough to stand up for himself, speak for himself, and to argue, to criticize what is happening around him. We find a sense of motivation that really lingers within his body. Even if his body is refusing to cooperate, his mind is still present. But there is also a third identity where we find that his voice is completely mute. We don't really see him speaking to his family members. Well, of course, because the family members have ultimately alienated him, neglected him, and that not only impacts the body, but also his soul, that only the readers can read, to be very honest. For example, you notice that he isn't eating anymore. He isn't, he doesn't, he craves for love and affection, but no one's really talking to him except the new maid that has been hired. But she also treats him nothing more than an insect. That's an idea we find. But with a lot of metamorphosis that we find in many of the text or many of the films, you're going to notice there is a structural foundation. What used to be, what has become now. So let's try to analyze the characters first. Gregor is the sole earner. The father is emasculated and is not working really. And we find that many times in many of the lines, we find that his father is actually quite ill or feels very ill. The mother is very passive, very quiet, and she's extremely anxious. And the sister, who's really young, and you must also keep that in mind, that she's around the time when she's a teenager. She is very dormant into her household. She's by herself. She's very domesticated. What she says really doesn't provide any value to the family, particularly because not only because she's young, but it could also be because she's a woman. But when we do find Gregor's transformation, we find the transformation of these family values and structures of the family. We find that the father is earning and his masculation is again back, which also intercepts an idea of the patriarchal notion of how when he doesn't feel emasculated anymore because he's working at a bank and he's paying for his family members, he is replaced by Gregor Samsa, or partially by Gregor Samsa. He becomes more violent, he becomes absent, he becomes very harsh and rude and crude towards his son, where at the very beginning, the son was very important for the father. The father-son relationship is incredibly important when we read Kafka's work, because in all of his work, the dynamics of family relationship is explored time and again. The sister has the most metamorphosis in this text. But this metamorphosis, while it seems liberating, and this is where we're going to again refer to our lecture notes, I want to expand on this a little bit because this is where we left off last class. We find that there is a sense of transformation in Grete as well, because she becomes also, she earns for the family. What she says is also very important. And initially, in the transformation of Gregor Samsa, she was the one who was taking care of him. But what happens to him, or the space that he is in, is also discoursed and decided by the sister. And because there is a form of shame that she associates with this relationship and dynamic as the text proceeds, we notion that this really breaks Gregor Samsa, but also at the same time, while it breaks his compassion and the sibling relationship, but also the love that he primarily faced but was unable to speak of. We find that Grete Samsa has a transformation that is very strong, financially capable, emotionally capable. She's very intellectual, and she's pursuing her passion, which initially wasn't taken quite seriously, but now what she says goes. But do we find this as self-liberating? And it's very important for you to study this because Franz Kafka, when he's writing this, he's questioning the structures and politicization of the body and the body politics in philosophy of nature and society as well, because her transformation comes at the cost of Gregor Samsa's decay. We try to understand if Kafka, although he has never really spoken about this openly, we study if her transformation, her liberation should actually come in cost of someone else's decay. We go back and try to study feminism really in generally. In For those who are unable to understand this notion of feminism or just in general what it really stands for, always believe that the role of womanhood or the role of women in any parts of the society means the death of manhood, means that men will no longer be relevant. But that's really not definitely the case. But the capitalistic notions and the social structural notion, which thrives on demeaning a certain class or community or gender so that the other gender really flourishes, is very, very important to have a discussion about. And this is what we often find out in society, that in order to practice our basic rights as women, we often have to fight all these structures that are primarily very patriarchal. And this patriarchal system not only impacts Gregor Samsa, but also the mother as well. Because when I'm speaking about the transformation of the entire family or the metamorphosis of the entire family, I'm talking about the father, I'm talking about the sister, but think about the mother for a second. We notice that Gregor's transformation of an insect is also passive and anxious, much like how the mother used to be. There is a slight change in the mother's perception because not only is the father absent, but the mother is also quite absent in this discourse because she's very exhausted. She's also quite anxious. But as she alienates herself from her son or the want to see her son, we notice that she doesn't really think quite a lot about the son anymore because if she did, we would find a constant need to talk to his son, to be able to see her son. But when the last, I think, image that we find that when she does see his son, when she was cleaning the room, she falls unconscious because her incapability to accept that the son is not going to perform the way he did for the modern society or the family really irks her as well if we try to notice. But we never really see that because she never voices it. But her behavior, her constant surprise, her constant astonishment is a predicament of relationships in general. So that's something that I want you to study as well. If we do see it from a feminist point of view, is it a punishing representation or a liberating representation? For example, does he really deconstruct the reader's expectation? He really does, because we notice that in the initial stages, Grete is very silent. She's very empathetic. She's very loving, and she's very observant of the changes that's happening in her brother's bodily transformation. So when he had an appeal to eat milk and cornflakes or like breakfast food, he no longer really likes it. So she's trying to experiment. She's very curious to understand, how should I make my brother's body sustain even if it has changed? So there's a sense of empathy we find in all of the characters, because the father did break down in tears when he realizes his son is no longer the son that he saw before. Study is also very important, particularly because if that's the certain case, what really changed? I think with time, it changed that they had to work, and the young male figure in the family is not existent. And in any social, cultural, and political figure of a modern society, if there is an absence of the strong, financially capable, rigorously hardworking man in a family, then the family no longer functions properly. And Is that the reality? Or perhaps that has been curated to be the reality is something that you must study in this text, because at the very end we notice that Sansa's death or declaration of the inability to accept his existence in the family really is voiced out by the sister. The sister cannot stand her brother's existence in the family because it's a constant reminder that she might lose her power, or she might lose who she truly has become, or it's becoming an obstruction to truly what she's becoming or morphing into. This revelation is very sad, and is this revelation itself is quite, again, says a lot about family structures and gender structure in general, because there is a sense of existential understanding from the reader when we read the very last line in the novel, for example. উম, এটা আরেকবার আপনারা একটু পড়ে দেখেন। এখানে Mr. and Mrs. Samsa, while they went on the bus, they got up the bus, they were leaving the house because Samsa has passed away. Now they can finally flourish and finally live the life that they always wanted to. But they were always able to do the same. They had the capacity, and the readers realized that they always had the capacity to live the way they wanted to. And that would even make life much easier for Samsa when he was a human being, a son and a brother. He wouldn't have to work so hard as a traveling salesman if they just moved into a smaller space, if all the family members contributed to the family. That could have made his life much easier, and they could have pursued the passions that they had always wanted to. Because the father, if he were so ill, if he was in debt, and his body is failing him, how come that his body is no longer failing him when the son is unable to provide for the family? But I go back and look into the metamorphosis of the sister one more time, because the very last lines really focus on her body, and we find that perhaps Gregor Samsa was viewed in the family is now being viewed on Grete now, because women and men in a capitalist society or a patriarchal society have certain expectations. And while the parents didn't really think of these expectations before, because they were so enamored in trying to financially and socially and under the class lens sustain in a community, they suddenly realized that Samsa is now stretching her body, almost metamorphosizing into this young, capable woman. And what are they expecting from her then? Now they're not expecting that finally maybe she'll be able to pursue the passion that she had always wanted to, because we only have one child now. No, now they're thinking of getting her married off. So this liberation is coming with a cost, because uh, now you're being replaced by someone else or something else. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, you realize that quite a lot, because Marx and Engels they talk about this in detail. They say that the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats and the elites have done something very interesting in intellectualizing these problems, but they forget to understand that all gender under the rule of capitalism is the product. Because if they can't sell you the product, you become the product. And under the product, you are nothing, anything else but a labor object of labor. She becomes the object of labor to pursue the patriarchal expectations of a woman. So this certain liberation that she had, that comes in the cost of her brother's death, then is not quite successful, is it? Because she's now expected to do what a woman does in a society. She is now a woman, so she must be married off to someone who's also quite capable. A young man who's quite capable, a good, honest man, a good, honest man. So, who is a good, honest man? When you think about it, let's go back to Samsa. Was Samsa not a good, honest man when he was a human being? it's a study that I would want you to look into a little bit more. If you want to also add a bit more in this discourse, it's quite important to notice that if you want to, that is. How does Grete really view her mother and her father in this instance? We notice that she has become quite closer in terms of making decisions for the family, whether it's financial, whether it's spatial, whether it's for a brother who's older than her, by the way. So representation of power is very important in this discourse as well. Is that power going to be taken away from her as she moves on to this new adventure that she's incredibly excited for? That's up to the readers, really. But the image of feminism and feminist discourse can definitely be done by the readers, particularly because Kafka has allowed us for having these discourses, particularly because the text is very dialogical, very polyphonic. And to that, I'm going to expand to our study of psychoanalytic analysis. When you look into the tone of the writing, it's very dialogical and very polyphonic, particularly because if you remember what we've studied about Bakhtin's work of dialogism, we discussed how in dialogism there is one voice. We understand the perception of the world, of the setting, of whatever that's happening in a certain text by one voice, but it's often replaced or disturbed or contradicted by the polyphonic voices or the multiple voices. This is very helpful in terms of psychoanalytic analysis, particularly because if you ever want to study about metamorphosis from the lens of the self and the other, which means the dualistic nature of life, it becomes very interesting. If Kafka didn't allow this, we wouldn't be able to really understand what is happening with Samsa effectively and impactfully. We are going to prioritize two figures right over here. And I'm again differentiating it from a gender perspective. Particularly, you need to understand how the father-son relationship worked. And so how did the sibling relationship work in terms of gender? Are all of these discourses then surrounded with the studies of financial capabilities and ability to provide? Does providing make you a good, honest person? Your inability to provide, what does that really say about you? Your inability to provide, will it inevitably alienate you from living a life with the other communities? Because let's say he's been working for as a traveling salesman for a very long time. And he also talks about how people view the traveling salesman as people who have remote jobs, they can travel anywhere they want, they can have breakfast with the people, they can sit very ideally because they're traveling, they can travel whenever they really want to. But if you look back into history, you will notice that that's not the kind of life that they really live. They don't have a leisure-like life because their life is not from adventure, rather traveling to meet ends meet. And so that's very important to notice. And while we notice that, we also have to study. And I go back again and again in the first parts of the text, particularly because we find the metamorphosis right over there, and then later how he was observed from different perceptions, not only of himself, but by the other family members, truly as well. Now, in the gender roles and conflicts that really subsides in the study, what I found in one of our studies that I've also provided in the Google Classroom, you'll notice that Kafka is time and again with his dialogical tone and the multiple voices is in a conflict to showcase that the self and how others perceive you are never really a fixed identity and it's not a fixed entity. If that's the certain case, you may argue, then how come we have fixed identities for a traveling salesman, for a man, for a woman? You can see this from a Marxist analysis or from a class analysis because a society or a class or politics in general works in a certain way that is so fixed so that the power and the sense of power is only provided to one part of uh, of a group because in other discourses, then it wouldn't be really power to begin with. পাওয়ার বলে কিছুই থাকতো না তাহলে। যদি আমরা সবাইকে সমানভাবে একটা ইগ্যালিটেরিয়ান সোসাইটি যদি আমরা বানাতে চাই, কখনোই পাওয়ার সিস্টেমটা কাজ করে না। ইউ ক্যান ডেলিগেট, but you will not have power. And that's what we as human beings are so afraid of. We crave it all the time. And in any setting, you'll notice this. We need power. Without power, you wouldn't really feel that kind of that high of self-liberation. But that's what it's connected to. And when we notice it from the self and the other, we notice that with time, with age, with the change of the body, and with the change of the structures of the society, the self and the other always keeps changing. And that's why we go back to Bakhtin, who says that in a text, it's a heteroglossia of opposed voices. For example, আপনাকে একটা পারফেক্ট যদি একটা বেসিক এক্সাম্পল দেওয়া হয়, আপনাকে যখন ভিউ করা হয় অ্যাজ আ স্টুডেন্ট, ইউর ভিউড অ্যাজ আ সার্টেন kind. When you're viewed as a son or a daughter, you're viewed as a certain kind. When you're viewed as a friend, as a cousin, sister, you have all these forms of viewing. And all these perceptions, when it comes into voices, can be interpreted in many, many ways. And so, what is the self really? Do we really find a sense of self in Samsa, or do we find that it's constantly fragmented? When you study this, we find that there is no presence of privileged voices. And I am reading this off from this text right over here. I've read this off from this text because I think this was really interesting, and it kind of focuses আপনি যা কিছুই পড়তে যাবেন psychoanalytical point of view থেকে, it talks about everything in this one 14 page paper or chapter. And that's why I think it's very effective for us right now, particularly because what she's trying to say, what Sweeney is trying to tell us, that at the beginning of the text, we find a certain kind of samsa. At the very end, we find a certain kind of samsa. But at the very end of the text, there is everything's happening to him. And his body is decaying, his emotions are fragmented, his needs and cravings for love is at its peak. But at the beginning, it wasn't like that, because we believe that he's going to change. There is going to be a certain kind of change. And these kind of tones and voices are incredibly intentional, because we as readers know that there must be another way. There is always another way. But we find that Kafka notoriously, agonizingly never gives us a solution. And this lack of solution gives us the space as readers to understand what's happening. It's important when you read certain text that works with monsters, creatures, or morphing in general. And it's very telling as readers, what do we really call Samsa at the very end of the text? Do we call him an insect, or do we still call him Samsa? I, as a reader, still call him Samsa, because all of the emotions, memories, and the craving of love really exists in Samsa, because he's still reasoning, not with other people, but reasoning within himself. Because the self and the other is, again, constantly in battle. If we go back and check the text, our notes will find this very clearly. What is the self and what is the other? The self cannot function without the other. The other are the multiple representations and existence of other people that view you as a person. This can be a problem because the other, or the form of otherizing, can also be very alienating. The self is how you view yourself from the perception of oneself and the other, right? It's very simple. Freud has mentioned it, Lacan has mentioned it, everybody talks about it, but everyone has a different perception of it. For example, if I see how I view myself, I can't simply view myself from all the perceptions I have of myself. What I am and my responsibilities in a community, in a relationship, or in a dynamic is very important. So I must need to view myself from the perception of others. সেটাই যদি হয়, তাহলে আমরা একটু নোট করি. This can be very helpful. এখানে we're gonna do a couple of notes, particularly over here. Let's study the self, right, for a second. The self. How did we view Samsa at the very beginning? Hardworking. He was very diligent. He's compassionate. He's punctual. A loving son. A respected individual in the family dynamic. Okay, so if that's the case, what else does he provide? He's a provider, an earner, a working class young man. That's it. এর চেয়ে বেশি আর কিছুই আমরা আসলে সামসার ব্যাপারে জানি না। আমরা জানি দ্যাট হি লাইকস ব্রেকফাস্ট ফুড। আমরা জানি যে ওর গায়ে অনেক ব্যথা ছিল প্রথমে, and despite of that he really pushed himself, so yes, he's very hardworking, I suppose. uh, But these are all external roles that makes him incredibly fragile, because you may lose your job tomorrow. You may lose someone that you love today, and that's what happens all the time. So to have that connection to bridge the gap of your characteristics and personality can be very absurd, because this inability to know the self is very tormenting, right? But how did how was he viewed from the other perspective? It's interesting, when we want to note this down, we realize that him being hardworking, diligent, punctual, all of it is from the perception of the mother, father, and primarily the sister, right? So what is the self really? We find in the text that the self of Gregor Samsa is intangible from the others. But let's try to focus on how his other had the perception of the other and self has then morphed really differently. When he becomes an insect, as the self, how does he view himself? Unworthy, fragile, incapable, mute, alienated. Okay, the other, how do others view him? The others view him as a disturbance. The others view him as একটা যেহেতু বোঝা হয়ে দাঁড়ায়, he becomes othered, irrelevant, burden. And that's very important for you to study how this dualistic nature was so fast because his body had given up. And this is where I discussed about disability. আপনি যদি এখন metamorphosis from the point of view of disability দেখে থাকেন, you'll notice how if you're chronically disabled, this is how people often try to view you, and often they won't try to take the responsibility of you. This is also quite important to study and notice. I was reading up on this article where actually I think সে জেএসসি পরীক্ষা দেওয়ার জন্য বসছেন, he's partially blind, and because he didn't find anyone to transcribe for him, he couldn't sit for the exam. And he was crying so much. And this apathy that we have for one another is it's not a modern phenomenon, because modernization or the modern life has started from the 19th century. But how we in the 21st century still sustain this kind of behavior is very important to study when we study metamorphosis, which is why I always tell everyone that you should always reread this text in every phase of your life. When you turn 70, read the Metamorphosis again. It'll be interesting. So we also find that in this dualistic nature, it gives us an opportunity to study behaviorist notion and materialistic notion. So behaviorist notion and materialistic notion যদি আমাদের পড়তে হয়, আমাদেরকে আগে বুঝতে হবে যে এগুলোর মানে কি, like what does it really stand for? It can be this term in itself, you can study it in language, you can study in culture, you can also study it in behavior. Let's say behaviorism or behaviorist study focuses on studying behaviors and not feelings. And again, none of these terms really focus on the soul. our opinions in general. Behaviors is studying the behavior in the physical environment. How is that environment really shaping this person? A very effective example would be if a student is motivated, despite of however they're performing, is a kind of motivation that either helps them or it doesn't help them. But if a student were to perform very well and then is motivated again and again and again, does that really help that certain student perform better in the other assessments? This is a very common study that ELT majors often try to do. So ওই এক্সাম্পলটা আমি আপনাকে দিতে পারছি। And materialistic is trying to rationalize everything. And not a lot of people really like this theory, particularly because they believe that your emotions, your soul, nothing of that matters. Because how your body reacts to certain emotions is the kind of emotions happening. For example, you are, let's say suddenly you're very anxious. Now, it doesn't matter who's making you anxious or what is making you anxious. As a materialistic point of view, to get out of that form of feeling momentarily, what you do is you take 5 or 6 deep breaths, because that is going to really help you understand that হ্যাঁ আপনার হচ্ছে একটা form of chemical in your body is reacting. Or when you're very happy, if you think, okay, so I'm happy right now because my dopamine receptors are at the very top and I feel I thrive in this kind of emotion. That's a materialistic kind of point of view that we find, or in general, the studies are being taken. In both of these studies, we kind of understand that it can be very helpful if we look into Samsa as an insect and Samsa as a young traveling salesman, particularly because আপনার social constructionটা যেমন থাকবে, the social construction of any generation is going to help us understand a behavioral point of view and a materialistic point of view, or materialist point of view. So behaviorist point of view তে আমরা প্রথম থেকে যদি কয়েকটা example দেখতে পারি in the text, we find that Gregor's companionship is very alienated, because he, as a traveling salesman, is alienated from everyone, yet he's respected by everybody, particularly because he's offering something from his labor. So he's appreciated in the society, but he's still quite alienated as well, behavioral point of view, take a behavior's point of view, take a declare. And when he was trying to turn the knob of the door, it was particularly because from the other side of the room, he could hear his father says, he's turning the doorknob. Wait for him to come back. That motivation really helped him. His eating habits also really changed, and the changes in this certain Gregor is quite effective because we notice that these changes are appreciated by the sister at the very beginning, but when he became a burden, a responsibility, she no longer really wanted to associate anything or any kind of relationship with the brother. That's also a study that you must also bring in. In terms of punishment, আপনি behaviors point of view থেকেই দেখে থাকেন, এটা common example যদি আপনাকে দিই, schooling system-এ আমরা দেখতে পারি if a student isn't performing very well, it has a violent result oftentimes. I know that they don't do that anymore. I hope they don't do that anymore, but you realize that they're punished. Either they have to stand outside the classroom for an hour. That means, again, you're alienated from the better performers of the classroom. These studies, when you were a child, you didn't have, because এই ধরনের revelations আমরা পাই না, but when we grow older, we realize that we're constantly alienated from the competition of wanting to pursue the best or being the best, right? And the punishment that we find in the Metamorphosis, we realized that initially there was a sense of empathy, there was a curiosity, there was a need to wanting to see him, there was a need to wanting to go to that certain space that he had been in for the entirety of the novel, particularly because he was in his room. But then we realize again and again and again that not only is he alienated because he's not welcome into the other parts of the houses, he's also alienated from himself, because the viewing of himself, he just couldn't be bothered anymore, because he didn't really know who his true self was, because his worth was then alienated from him being a hardworking son, a loving and compassionate sibling, and just in general, a traveling salesman who would be very punctual at his work. If all of this is absent, who is he really? And that study, we never really get to understand. That is very telling for us as readers. We get to understand that, let's say for a second, I separate myself from all these people, from all these responsibilities. Who am I really? These kind of studies after Chan, you can also read uh, the Buddhist scriptures that always tells you to alienate yourself from all the worldly activities and materialistic activities. That's also very important to do. If you want to do that reading, you absolutely can. But punishment is a very behaviorist point of view that we can find in the text, because যতভাবে social constructionটা বারবার করে চেঞ্জ হচ্ছে, it's changing, it's morphing. The more he's being alienated, the more he's punished, and becoming separated from the family. You also notice that there is a constant need for the father to really present himself in this dynamic. And whenever he presents himself in this dynamic, we often find that he's very violent towards his son. We go back and think about all the diaries that he had written and left for the readers that he didn't want to, but he left them, and we noticed that his father, Kafka's father, in reality was also quite violent because Kafka wasn't man enough, or he wasn't strong enough, he wasn't sturdy enough. All these really shadow in his work as well. The materialist point of view could be the body in itself. আপনি যদি বডিটা পরে দেখেন, the body itself, as you can see in my background, is going to be very helpful. Uh, in the text, whenever we see the study of Kafka, there's the insect. The insect is pretty big, and I always noticed it from the point of view of a cockroach. But there was a study, I know I'm moving away from the narrative, but it's also quite important. আপনি নাবকভের কাজ পড়লে পরে বুঝতে পারবেন যে when Vladimir Nabokov he tries to study the text, he notices that he said in the text or in the lecture, you'll see that he'll say that this insect is not a small insect. At the very least, this is a beetle, of course, because of the physical transformation and the constant by chapter, we find that the changes are happening, and it almost always resembles a beetle. Beetle is interesting because in poetry, beetle also foreshadows death. So that's interesting that I found, and I think I agree. But as a reader, I have also my independent thoughts. That's also important. So he says that at the very least, he is a beetle who's dog-sized. Yes, Shajul. Shajul, do you have an observation?
Yes, Miss.
Yes.
So I'm sure you've at least heard of Murakami's Samsa in Love.
Yes. I have it in my
Yes. So, do you think that could be helpful or useful in our discourse or analysis of this text?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because when we read Murakami, not only do we find an important cultural discourse and infusion, but also the fact that we study there's the contemporary outlook of love in general and connection in general. It is ideally and idealistically and rationally always alienated from the form of self. So if you do read Murakami, and if you have read Murakami, definitely include that narrative too. Because Murakami's work, if you read much of Murakami's work, you find that the characters or the protagonists also have a very similar way that Gregor Samsa is, and not of the Kafka's other protagonists, but just in general. Like if you've read Kafka on the Shore, right, you see that the central figure is also a lot like Samsa because his paralysis is not, yes, it's not physical, but it's also quite emotional. So that's a very good observation, Nali. That was really good. Uh, Going back to Nabokov and trying to understand, and this is where I was citing the third space, right? In his lecture, which I will share as well in our Google Classroom, he says that we also always almost find a triadic system, like in a triangle, which is always in three. What does that really showcase? And with that conclusion, we can see that perhaps there was a third identity we find, because the morphos or the transformation or morphosis in the sister also comes in three different stages. The chapter is divided into three different forms or sectioned in three different chapters. That's interesting. Is three Kafka's favorite number? We do not know, but that's something very repetitive that we have found out. Going back to studying the narrative of what the entomological study or anthropological study could be, if you want to have that notion, you can definitely go through that lecture that Vladimir Nabokov really says, because he focuses on how beetle in itself could be the insect that we can think of if we want. Um, that was very interesting. Let's go back again a little bit. Uh, this is, we go back again. I had a last one idea that I wanted to share about the materialistic notion, and I want you to write this down as well. In the materialistic point of view or materialist point of view, there was an economic response from each of the family members. And also in terms of spatial discourse is also important. Spatial discourse বলতে আমরা কি বুঝি? যে বাসায় কি কি ধরনের চেঞ্জেস এবং ট্রান্সফরমেশন এসেছে সেটাও আমাদের দেখা খুবই ইম্পর্টেন্ট. Particularly because we notice at the very end of the text, we find that part of the house or one of the houses were up for rooms were up for rent. And because it was up for rent, there was inclusion of the public space within this private space because they wanted to earn more and kind of reestablish their reestablishment of their previous class structure. There was a constant struggle that they did not want to admit that they would evidently become broke or they would just be in a lower certain class. They could not accept it. And how there is this, we as general, as society, we cannot accept uh, with or be content with what we have. We always want more and more and more. And that's also the study we find in the spatial discourse, if you want. And with that spatial discourse, I would also want to talk a little bit about sound, if you want. And it's because of the inner psychosis that we find in Kafka's work. I'm going to go to the novel. Let's go. We find that later he doesn't really make any noises as he's. And when he calls out to his mother by constantly screaming his name, we find that the mother doesn't really respond. Does it mean that it was an internal voice, or was he actually calling out to the mother and the mother just couldn't decipher what he's trying to say? Because when the clerk says like, can you hear him? He's not sounding really proper. The transformation was happening by that time. And he could feel in his body, he could feel when he was speaking that, yeah, this isn't really going well for him. And this kind of sound or the sonic theory that we have, how sound really travels, and there is an absence of sound, so there is an absence of discourse as well. The inability, the apathetic notion of someone or people you love the most not truly understanding who you are and what you want, and which is basic compassion, basic understanding, a little bit of respect is completely absent. And again, you can read this part right over here. It also talks about the space outside. Even these a short distance away, the hospital across the street, the all too frequent sight of which he had previously cursed, was not visible at all anymore. And if he had not precisely aware that he lived in the quiet but completely urban Charlotte Street, he would have believed from his window he was peering out at a featureless wasteland. So that's also a study that you may want to do, that his body and how the space is apathetic towards his transformation as well. He has no longer the ability to see the world the way he used to, a world that was constructed of industrialization, a noisy rural space, and trying to be its best transform into a city. The metro, the sound of the metro, all of that loudness really doesn't exist anymore because he's an insect. And what can he really do rather than being yanked out of a room or yanked out of into his own room? And also the fact that his room in general was no longer constituted of who he truly was because it was replaced as a storeroom. And what do you keep in your storeroom? We've discussed about this last cast, right? You keep things that are no longer relevant, that you're not going to use in your day-to-day life, much like how Samsa was in his day-to-day life. He was no longer quite relevant. That's a study that I think you can also bring in if you want. Again, specific, very specific in the study. Now, does he speak at the very end? Can we say that he was himself at the very, very end? I would want you to watch or read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, if you can, and understand that perhaps even if there aren't or absence of certain humanistic responsibility, doesn't necessarily mean that his human-like body or human-like emotions, his memories are erased, because he looks at his sister when he plays a violin and feels this incredible form of love that he could never really decipher beforehand. And that is triggered by music. And Kafka then says, and Samsa then thinks to himself that, am I really an animal if I enjoy this music so much? And the fact that all of these people are not appreciating her work, why don't I go and show that I really appreciate her work? But again, his body refuses to showcase the kind of love that he wants. Much like animals in general, they do love you and they want to show that affection, but that sometimes it can be really violent because, again, they're just animals. And so, again, the self is not the self. And this is what Matthew Powell says. The self and what is not the self, Kafka is able to explore with the sense of other. This space is critical for maintaining notions of self and identity. We find the transformation of identity to showcase the troubling nature of society and responsibility, how you are only and only measured by what you can provide and nothing else. John Locke's idea of what consciousness really is helps in this discourse. I think 494 কথা ছিল. I want you to read this a little bit and try to see what you find from this discourse. What is a human being? He's a thinking, intelligent being that has reasons and reflections and can consider itself the same thinking things and different times and places, for since consciousness always accompanies thinking. And it is that what makes everyone to call himself the self, as far as his consciousness can be extended backwards to the past. And we know for sure that this is not an insect or a creature. A part of Samsa is still alive, because when the sister closes the door before announcing that she no longer wants to associate with this person and he would be better dead, he comes to this utter sense of betrayal. But this, he doesn't feel really betrayed. He feels misunderstood. And this misunderstanding is so painful for him that, in a very, again, dualistic view, we can think that he perhaps did kill himself, or the pain really killed him. It was the space, it was the other that forced his body to be immobile through and through. And John Locke says that you're human as long as you have these certain criteria of distinguishment of the past, this distinguishing of the past, of your memories, that consciously enables you to think more about your presence, makes you an intellectual. Descartes also says something interesting, that the difference between an animal and a man particularly focuses on reasoning. So আপনি যদি reasoning করতে পারেন তাহলে you're not an animal, you're a human being, because এই reasoning capabilityটা আপনার কাছে আছে. Again, this is what he's saying many, many years ago. If that's the certain case, and I want to go back and see with paperটা that I can really help you out. There are so many tabs that are open. Never mind, I can just read it off from my mind. He says, Jay, there are three ideas that you can focus on if you have the reasoning. If you have reasoning, you can have a certain kind of intellectuality. And third, from all of these reasonings, your bodily movement showcases what you want to do and what you don't want to do. So let's say when you want to go to war, your body functions a certain way. If you want to go to work, your body functions a certain way. You wouldn't be violent in certain spaces if you don't want to, and that's kind of common. But that space and all the reasonings of being a human and an animal, that was again an amalgamation of both in Samsa's body, which is why this text is incredibly chaotic. It is very confusing because Samsa himself is very confused, and the readers can't help but sympathize because it's and empathize both at the same time. Sympathize because, we're not insects, but empathize because all of us has at certain point of their life, we all of us have gone through these kind of painful realization of our worth or unworthiness together at the same time. I wanted to talk a bit about this last class, and I did, and I'm going to go back and refer to this writing. All of what I'm saying is referred from this writing. এই কারণে হচ্ছে I'm showing this to you. If this is, I'm going to go back and check if it's not present here. এটা একটু পড়ে দেখেন. Gregor's mental states are at odds with his transformed body, which is why we can't, in our own rational consciousness, say that this is actually a human being trapped in an insect's body, because at the very end, he himself was very confused into understanding who he truly is. Is he a bug, or is he a human being? Tough to really say, right? So he's always in clash with himself. And we find that he tries to think in the beginning, okay, this is just a dream, this is just an imagination. If I go back to sleep and I wake up again, it'll be all right. And this is where this researcher mentions something very important about Franz Brentano's theory and his lectures. He mentions that there's a sense of intentionality in your and within yourself. আপনি একটা অবজেক্টকে ধরে যত ধরনের আইডিওলজিজ আনবেন বা philosophical ideas আনবেন, you can definitely structure around it if you want. For example, this clip is an object. This has a certain kind of criteria and value, right? It helps me define my hair. That's fine. But what happens if this becomes my favorite object, and I then put all kind of emotions in it? Then if I give it a name, and if I associate memories with this, if I lose it, it will be very, very painful for me, or momentarily very painful for me. And he speaks about intentionality like that as well. Maybe Samsa, when he was himself a human being, felt like a bug. All this pain that he can associate later in his body, he associated before as well, irrelevant of what the body had transformed itself into, because intentionally in your mind, you could still feel that. For example, a perfect example would be of unicorn. People in the West or in America, they believe in Santa Claus and they believe in unicorn, and they associate a lot of fairy tales, a lot of myths, a lot of celebrations surrounding that, knowing very surely that that's not really the case. But intentionality really works in that philosophical way. You can read this part as well to relate to this theory. The possibility of Gregor's predicament might be imaginary, even though the experience is very vivid or challenge. There are a lot of challenges that come within, which is why I bring in the notion of disability. Was he perhaps not an insect at all? What if he just became disabled and all of this became very imaginary? He felt like an insect. Of course, that's another idea as a reader I have, but of course, when we're reading it, we can see that he has become an insect because there are all these instances that showcase that he is an insect. But what does him being an insect, please write that down, this is also important. What is this him being an insect, him being disabled, unable to provide, what do these symbolize? That's also very important and very conceptual in your reading. The reader's attitude has an underlining framework of the stories that slowly begins to shift because we suddenly realize that this will never have a good ending. This isn't going anywhere because when we look into objective structures of writing, সবকিছুর একটা শুরু থাকে এবং একটা foreshadowing থাকে. Foreshadowing থেকে there is an ending. There's a certain ending. Something happens in the end. Preferably, we want a happy ending. We want a solution. But any philosophical readings of fictions will never give you a happy ending. When you read Frankenstein, you are tormented with the idea that he's going to live forever. We think that it's a happy ending. Like, who doesn't want to live forever, right? But you don't. And even if you do live forever, it doesn't mean that you have all the time in the world to achieve all that you've always wanted. Sometimes a lot of time is not really a good ending. Having a lot of time, a lot of youth, all the time in the world or eternity can never help you achieve what you're unable to achieve. This incapability comes with the structures of the space that you are currently in. And that's simply the hard truth. That's what it truly is. That's why vampire stories, you see, whenever you read any vampire story and you notice that a vampire is living forever and ever and ever, the vampire itself isn't really having a good time. And we notice that Samsa himself, with time, his body is decaying, but he is still living. And for a very short amount of time or moment, for example, let me try to find this out with the PDF. Yeah, read this, for example. Was he really an animal? Was he an animal that music so seized him? For him, it was as if the way to the unknown nourishment he craved was revealing itself to him. With music, he realized that he craved not music, he craved what it feels to be loved, to be taken care of, or not even to be taken care of for a second, just to be in the presence of others that he truly, truly loves. This incapability torments him. We can go back and think about 2020 or COVID, how we're always alienated. Even within a space that we're all living together, there's a sense of alienation because there's a constant anxiety, there's a constant emotion that is troubling us, that alienates our family members from one another because we're worried about something that will eternally hamper our life. And that slowly but surely translates into different parts of our lives and different stages of our age. And that's what's happening in SAMHSA as well, within SAMHSA as well. Uh, that's a sort of study that we are going to understand and study. Can you give me a bit of a second? Like 1 minute. Sorry, my mother was calling me. Okay. So here we look into this study as well. If it were Gregor, he would have long ago realized that a communal life among human beings is not possible with such an animal and would have gone away voluntarily. Then he would not have a brother. Then we would not have a brother, but we could go on living and honor his memory, showcasing that his transformation, she's vocalizing it, that his transformation is a disturbance. His existence is a hurdle to everybody's well-being, just well-being in general. So that really affects someone. If someone were to tell you that your existence is disturbing them, well, how would you really feel? That would break you. You would no longer want to exist there. But where is he going to go? But his body is so weak that he does pass away, and we never really get to see what his life would have been if he were simply just an insect and being loved and appreciated by all his family members. That's just the harsh reality that we conclude ourselves to. I discussed a lot about shame over here, and that I talked about at the beginning of the class, but I've like noted them down for you. And if you ever look into the doodles that he does in his own work, you find that the stick figures that he often draws is always very hunched, or it's always very active or anxious because he's feeling a lot of shame and anxiety all at the same time. And this transformation is also important because Kafka in his own life never really felt like he was very good looking. He never felt like he had the body that one is supposed to have in a modern society, or one expects to have in a modern society. That troubles him quite a lot as well. His incapability to have proper relationship or a marriage throughout Kafka's life is also reflected in his work as well. But for all of this, you may need to look into certain documentaries or read his diaries to truly understand what I'm trying to really say when I look into Samsa and then Kafka both at the same time. Um, Shame is existent in all of the members, but how is it primarily showcased in Grete and Gregor is something that you want to study a bit, because shame works in a very transformative way as well. While this is a very important thematic core in the novel, we find that Grete was never really shameful that he had turned into someone who had this incapability of uh, pursuing a life of a regular man, but later, surely, as she had the ability to make decisions and work for herself, she had this very rapid, totalitarian view of if I work really hard, so what I will say is going to be more important than what my brother, who has, or Samsa's Grete Samsa's brother has to say is no longer relevant because he has turned into an insect. And so that power dynamic shift also brought in shame within Grete. Grete wasn't shameful for everyone who was treating Gregor Samsa or her brother harshly. It was particularly because they weren't treating him harshly enough. And that's why at the very end we see that he's forced to believe that he would be better off dead. So that's an interesting study. Mm, is there anything more I want to talk about from my notes? Not really, but you would want to look into the social
Sounds good.
persona, a social persona, unified consciousness. Is there a unified consciousness or is there a fragmented form of consciousness? I want you to study that as well if you get the opportunity to do so. Do you have any questions? Before you have questions, let me pause. Yes, Shasha, what's the question?
There's another question. You talked about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Iktoaki,
Yeah.
and that got me thinking. Like just saw the movie, right? And that got me thinking how in this text he longs for human connection and love, and Murakami sort of fixes that,
Mm-hmm.
where is Samsa the Samsa that turns from a bug to a human.
Yeah.
He becomes enamored by the hunched over the lockpick lady
Yeah.
who has a hunchback, right? Who's a hunchback. So it sort of mirrors back to what Frankenstein's monster asks from Frankenstein to build him or create him a a lady, a lady monster, so
Yeah.
that he can spend his eternity with her. So
Mm-hmm.
that's sort of like how this Samsa, Murakami Samsa finds this other who would not be traditionally seen as beautiful, right? The
Yes.
hunchback lady who could be seen as a monster,
Mm.
like if we are talking like contemporary standards. So I like that how that Samsa is a bug is a bug that turns into a human and then sees this human and who he sees a bug inside her and sort of feels for her. So it mirrors back to Shelley's how monsters like one monster gravitates towards another monster.
That's a very good observation. Do you also want to also notice how Samsa, Gregor Samsa, we don't have a discourse of his interest or love interest as of lately. We didn't find it in the entire text, but what we did find, interestingly, in the text of how he's trying to protect a poster of a very alluring woman who is wearing
Mhm.
fur. Again, a very animalistic
Mhm.
attire. But at the same time, we find Gregor Samsa at the very end wanting companionship from the sister, who has then become the central figure of the family who is also not only financially helping out all the family members in the dynamic, but also has the power to enter in the room or in the space that he is already quite aware of. But there's also a sense of betrayal. This betrayal, I also go back and look into Victor and Frankenstein of
Hmm.
how
Yes.
that's a distortion between the family members because ultimately when you think about it, this is a father-son relationship and how that translates into even Kafka's work, shadows Kafka's work. Can we
Yes.
call his work Gothic? Kafka's work Gothic? No, it's still modern, but the Gothic literature that Mary Shelley had left behind for all of us to read, even in 2025, is again morphing into so many different ways. Which
Yeah.
brings me to the question, like, as Shajal has already watched it, everyone should watch the new rendition of Frankenstein. It's fantastic for your reading, especially Notes from Underground and for the Metamorphosis. It's incredible.
Yes,
So
but also if this is to be considered Gothic, then his silence could be Gothic silence. Who's Samsa's Gothic silence?
yeah, but also we can't consider it Gothic because like everything is structured in different time frames in the Victorian
Uh-huh.
period, the modern period. But yes, if we were to, definitely, because Goth Frankenstein's and I would okay, there will be a lot of spoilers, but why don't you guys watch Frankenstein and then try to relate it to the Underground Man and or also like the Metamorphosis, of course. You can do that. Definitely. Thank you.
Also, if Greta's relationship can be seen as a motherly dynamic towards Samsa, then we can also see an Oedipal complex between them, which also mirrors back to Frankenstein's relationship between himself and his monster.
Yes, absolutely. And also Victor and Victor's
Own father.
infatuation with his brother's sister is
Yeah.
also very Oedipal as well. There is a certain complexity we find. But when I was rereading the text, I realized Gregor Samsa's transformation as an insect translates equal to the mother. The mother's presence was very quiet and very dormant, but he had then become like much like his mother. And so that's why he kept constantly pushing forward to see the mother, but that was also quite absent because in a structural space, the mother, if he no longer resonates his true form of the son, she's not going to accept him, and she doesn't at the very end. So that's a study that we can see. Even we don't even know, like when he looks back and sees the family members, he notices that the mother is half asleep because she's so tired, and so they never really have a final goodbye. So that's very sad. That's another outlook and example we can find in terms of the self and the other. Okay, so what?
You're muted.
Ma'am, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Was I muted the whole time? Oh no.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was saying is don't leave because I'm taking the attendance and I'm taking the attendance via screenshots. Here you go. Okay, perfect. Thank you, you guys. So I've been told that the midterms have been extended. So the next 1 week, I think we're going to have classes. And if that's the case, tahole, I'll see you in class. We're going to study Albert Camus. It's going to be even more painful. Then it gets more painful. So yeah, I'll see you next class. Okay, so I'm going to cut this off
Assalamualaikum,
now.
Miss.
Walaikum
Thank you,
salam.
miss.
Bye
Thank you,
bye,
ma'am.
Assalamualaikum, ma'am.
guys.